imagine an empire. I mean, the glorious Tang Dynasty, so utterly shattered by a decade of civil war that the emperor's own household, they couldn't reliably put food on the table.
It's the ultimate collapse scenario. The royal coffers were just empty.
Completely. The land was devastated.
They were facing total financial obliteration. But here's the puzzle, right? How did this massive collapsing state manage to pull off the ultimate financial trick? How did they find a stable income stream that didn't just, feed the court, but actively funded their survival and then subsequent dynasties' defense for the next 700 years?
It's an incredible story. It's all about fiscal ingenuity born from just pure desperation. We're talking about two really crucial financial fixes that were implemented right after the Lushan Rebellion that saved this dynasty.
And the political backdrop to this is pure Shakespearean tragedy. I mean, the two brilliant minds who implemented these fixes, you have the long-term stable diet on one hand and the short-term emergency medicine on the other, they were bitter political rivals.
Bitter is an understatement.
Oh, yeah. Chancellor Liu Yan, who brought in the two-tax system, eventually ordered the execution of the other minister, Liu Yan.
It's unbelievable, and yet history binds them together as the fiscal twins. Their collective reforms were this invaluable legacy that allowed the Tang to just limp forward after all that devastation.
And today, we're focusing on the medicine minister Liu Yan's radical overhaul of the salt administration, which happened in 762 AD.
This deep dive is really about understanding how Liu Yan created the ultimate tool for fiscal flexibility, the empire's life-saving money, by turning, of all things, a common kitchen item into state oil revenue.
But the core conflict, the thing we have to resolve, is this paradox at the heart of it all. This salt profit was absolutely essential. It paid for the military, for official salary.
It kept the lights on.
It kept the lights on, exactly. And yet, for centuries, it was viewed through this very specific moral lens. It was seen as inherently evil.
Oppressive.
Oppressive, a state mechanism that was, and this is the quote, competing with the populace for profit.
So how can something so vital for survival be seen as so fundamentally wrong at the same time?
To answer that, you have to first understand the fundamental chemistry of salt itself. You have to understand why it was the perfect financial trap.
Okay, let's unpack that. When an ancient empire needed money, when they needed to fund their operations, the military, the bureaucracy, infrastructure, they really only had three basic levers in their fiscal toolkit.
Right. Three ways to take money from the populace.
Yeah.
You can tax people, you can tax land, and you can tax commerce.
And each one came with huge inherent trade-offs.
Massive trade-offs. Let's start with the easiest one, just conceptually. The poll tax. That's just taxing people based on a head count.
Right. You exist, you pay a tax.
Exactly. And its great advantage is pure simplicity. It's easy to count heads, and if you know how many people you have, you know exactly how much revenue you should be getting.
But I can already feel the problem with that. People must have absolutely hated it.
Oh, it's the worst. It's too direct, it's highly visible, incredibly unfair, and it reliably provokes outright resistance. People historically despise being asked for a direct, flat head tax, especially, when their income can vary wildly from year to year.
And I imagine it's hard to collect without being really heavy-handed.
Extremely. You need a massive bureaucracy just to enforce it. So, okay, that's one. Then you have the land tax.
This one sounds fairer, right? The tax burden is tied directly to the land you own or the crops you produce. It's proportional to your wealth, which feels more logical.
It does sound logical, but managing it was a logistical nightmare for a pre-modern state. I mean, think about it. To do it fairly, you need complex, accurate surveying technology across a massive empire.
And honest record keepers.
The ledger management required a serious non-corrupt bureaucracy, which was rare. So land taxes always suffered from corruption and inefficiency because the records were so easily manipulated or just lost.
Okay, so that brings us to the third one. Taxing commerce. This would be things like tariffs, duties, sales taxes.
Right. And the strategic genius of this method is that the tax is disguised. It's sort of embedded in a voluntary transaction.
So the merchant just raises the price a little bit?
The merchant raises the price, they shift the tax burden to the consumer, and the consumer often doesn't even perceive it as the state reaching directly to their pocket. You achieve this ideal effect of taxing people without incurring their resentment.
That sounds like the holy grail of taxation. If you can tax people without them hating you, why did the empire rely on anything else?
Because it suffers from two huge practical disadvantages. The first is high management costs. I mean, monitoring every trade, every road, every intersection. that requires massive infrastructure and staffing.
And the second.
The ease of tax evasion. Merchants are, by their nature, flexible. They can move goods around your collection points, they can hide transactions, they can bribe the local officials. It's a constant cat and mouse game.
So the imperial system was always trying to balance these three levers: visibility, complexity, and enforceability. Which finally brings us back to salt.
Yes, because Liu Yan's great insight, his genius, was realizing that this thing, salt profit, managed to leverage the advantages of both the poll tax, the fact that it hits everyone, and the commercial tax, the fact that it's disguised.
While minimizing the classic downsides of both.
Exactly.
Okay, so salt isn't just a commodity. You're saying it's the perfect fiscal trap. This is where it gets really interesting. What makes salt so unique compared to, say, silk or grain?
Well, you have to look at two key economic characteristics. The first is something called low elasticity and non-substitutability.
Okay, what does that mean in simple terms?
It means your consumption doesn't really change that much with your wealth or with the price. And crucially, you can't substitute it for anything else.
Right, you're not going to start eating a whole plate of salt just because you suddenly got rich.
Exactly. And you won't cut it out of your diet entirely just because the price went up a little bit. You need it to live.
And not just to eat, but for food preservation, right? In a pre-refrigeration world, this is critical.
Absolutely critical. So up to a certain threshold, which the state got very good at setting, your consumption stays roughly the same across all wealth levels. There is no other commodity that can truly substitute for salt. This guarantees a stable, constant, non-negotiable demand.
So if the state needs guaranteed revenue, salt guarantees the demand. You can't just stop people from needing it.
That's part one. The second characteristic is purely logistical and administrative, and that's at low management cost.
How so?
Well, think about grains, rice, wheat, barley. They're grown everywhere. To tax them effectively, you have to survey every field, monitor every harvest, chase down every small farmer across 1 million square miles. It requires an impossibly large bureaucracy.
But salt production, it's not like that.
Not at all. Salt fields are highly localized. You can't just make edible salt anywhere. Production is geographically limited, mainly to coastal areas or a few specific, well-known inland lakes and basins.
So the state can control the entire supply chain just by controlling those production sites.
Precisely. They don't have to police the whole empire. They only need to police a handful of production bottlenecks: the salt fields themselves, the ports, the storage depots.
So let me get this straight. You have a product that every single human needs, no matter how rich or poor they are.
Yep.
And the state only has to control a few geographic points to control the entire supply.
That is the most sustainable, high-yield revenue stream possible for an imperial treasury. It's a fiscal dream.
So we've established the why. Now let's get into the how. How did the state actually extract this revenue? We know the collective term was salt profit, or yan li, and historically there were three main ways they did it.
Right. Method number one is the most direct: a full state monopoly. The state handles everything: production, transport, sales, and it captures every single penny of profit.
And this was the old system.
This was the system the Han Dynasty used, and it's the one that Tang tried to resurrect pretty disastrously right after the Anlushan Rebellion.
Okay, what's method two?
Method two is the licensing system. This is where the state issues permits or franchises to private operators for specific stages of the process, usually transport and sale. And in return, it charges them hefty fees or big upfront payments.
So the state controls the bottleneck, but lets private capital handle all the hard work.
That's it. And that is Liu Yan's great reform.
And the third method?
Method three is the pure taxation system. The market is just opened up entirely to private operation, and the state simply levies a specific dedicated tax on the trade. It's a lot like a modern excise duty.
But that would require a really effective tax collection agency.
Which is why it comes much later.
Yeah.
It requires a high level of state enforcement capacity, but it maximizes private efficiency.
Okay, now for the financial aha moment. This is where the moral controversy really comes in. You said salt profit leveraged the advantages of the poll tax. So why do scholars argue that it's essentially a regressive poll tax, just disguised as a commercial tax?
Because the price of salt isn't determined by the free market. Not at all. It is actively manipulated by the state to maximize revenue. The state intentionally inflates the wholesale price far, far beyond the actual cost of production and transport.
And because everyone needs roughly the same amount of salt enough for their family for a year, that inflated price becomes a fixed cost for every single household, no matter what their income is.
Exactly. Let's use some simple numbers to make this really tangible. Imagine you have a peasant family that earns, say, 100 strings of cash a year. The state-inflated price of salt forces them to spend 10 of those strings just to stay alive and preserve their food.
So that's 10% of their total income on one commodity.
10%. Now imagine a wealthy landlord who earns 10,000 strings of cash a year. They also spend 10 strings on salt for their household. For them, that is 0.1% of their total income.
So the burden is wildly different.
It's massively different. The price increase, which is really the tax hidden inside the price, disproportionately crushes the poor. It functions precisely like a flat-rate poll tax, but because it's baked into the price of a commodity, the state can claim it's just commerce. They can say they're taxing people without incurring their resentment.
But in reality, it was undeniably oppressive. It hit the poorest families the hardest.
It's the ultimate paradox. Fiscally, it's perfect. A guaranteed high-yield revenue stream with low management costs.
Yeah.
But morally, it is inherently compromising because it relies on extracting a larger proportion of income from those who are least able to afford it.
It's an inescapable tax on survival itself.
That's the perfect way to put it.
So we have the perfect commodity for state control, but now we need to zoom back into the chaos of 762 AD. The Tang dynasty is utterly devastated by the Anlushan rebellion. The empire survived, but its financial system is just broken.
The imperial treasury was severely strained. I mean, not only was the land tax collection completely unreliable because all the registers were destroyed and officials were fleeing,
Right.
but the state needed cash, and
Yeah.
it needed it immediately. They had to fund the remaining armies, reward loyalists, and just rebuild the court.
So when Liu Yan took charge of this mess, the mechanism they were using for salt profit was that ancient one you mentioned, the restored state monopoly system. The government was trying to handle the whole supply chain itself.
And this restoration was a catastrophic failure on every single level. We mentioned the political tension earlier, and this failure feeds directly into it. The state monopoly was supposed to be bringing in massive revenue, but instead it was just riddled with severe efficiency losses and pervasive corruption.
Let's talk about that corruption. Just how bad was it?
Think about the incentives. If you're a local official managing a salt production depot, you have guaranteed control over an essential commodity that everyone needs.
You're sitting on a gold mine.
You're sitting on a salt mine, which is better than a gold mine. You could easily skim salt off the top, sell it privately to local merchants, and just pocket the proceeds. It was almost expected.
So the officials were basically running a parallel private salt administration inside the state system.
That's a great way to put it. They were creating an illicit internal market. So the quality of the salt that actually reached the people was terrible, yet the prices were excessively high because the state bureaucracy was so inefficient and costly.
And the officials were getting rich.
The officials at every level were gaining massive personal profit. They were buying carriages, building huge estates, while the central state itself, the treasury, was receiving very little actual revenue. It was a classic, inefficient state-owned enterprise, draining the treasury instead of replenishing it.
So you have a poor product, skyrocketing prices for the consumer, and all the actual profit is flowing into the pockets of corrupt officials, not the imperial treasury. Liu Yan is facing a crisis on top of a crisis, and his rival Wang Yan is just watching him.
And this massive failure is what justified Liu Yan's radical pivot. He realized the state was just terrible at logistics, at production, and at retail. So in 762 AD, he initiates this revolutionary shift away from the state monopoly and toward a licensing system.
He decided the only way to maximize public profit was to leverage private efficiency.
The state realized it was terrible at logistics, production, and retail. They had to outsource efficiency to the profit motive.
Okay, let's detail the core mechanism here, because this is the blueprint that basically saved the dynasty. Liu Yan introduced a sophisticated public-private partnership. He said it was based on 4 stages: private manufacture, official purchase, merchant transport, and merchant sale.
Right. It was a huge shift away from that inefficient state-owned enterprise model and towards something more like a modern franchise or concession model.
Okay.
The state basically retreated from the decentralized, complex stages that it was failing at.
So private manufacturers could produce the salt using their own labor and capital. That right there would immediately improve efficiency and quality compared to unreliable state workers.
Correct. But here's the critical second step: official purchase. The state monopolized only the purchase stage. They would buy all the salt from those private producers at a fixed, very low rate.
And that step is crucial. That's what allows the state to set the margin, the difference between the cheap price they buy it at and the high price they sell it for. That's the state's profit.
That is the revenue generation engine right there. The state is buying cheap and selling expensive. But who are they selling to?
The merchants.
To licensed merchants, exactly. That's the merchant transport and merchant sale stages. These private merchants handled the complex, often dangerous logistics of moving the salt from the depots into the vast interior markets and then managing the retail sale to the public.
So the state keeps control over the single supply bottleneck, that official purchase depot, which lets them stabilize the market and maximize revenue while outsourcing all the heavy lifting of distribution to profit-driven private capital.
And the government's revenue stream now came from two really robust sources. First, the markup on the wholesale price of the salt itself, and second, the direct revenue from selling the licenses, the franchises, to all these eager merchants who wanted in on this highly lucrative, state-guaranteed monopoly distribution network.
Okay, this is where I have to challenge this genius label. If you're unleashing profit-driven private merchants on a commodity that has non-negotiable demand, what stops them from just massive price gouging and abuse? Wouldn't that undermine the stability the state needs?
That is a crucial question, and it really speaks to the sophistication of the regulation. The state didn't just sell a general license to trade salt. They designated specific, tightly controlled territories where each merchant could sell.
So you couldn't just sell anywhere.
No. And even more importantly, the state fixed the maximum retail price.
So the merchants made their profit on volume and efficiency, not on just jacking up the price beyond the state's regulated ceiling.
Exactly. They were effectively franchised agents of the state's regressive tax. It was a form of controlled capitalism leveraging private efficiency, while the state retained total control over pricing and supply.
The immediate results must have been a shock to the system. The imperial balance sheet desperately needed a miracle.
It was a miracle. Let's state the results clearly, because they are the proof of concept. Before Liu Yan's reform, that ineffective state monopoly was bringing in only about 400,000 guan a year.
And a guan is a string of 1,000 copper coins.
Right. And 400,000 is barely enough to cover a fraction of the capital's administrative costs.
Yeah.
It's nothing.
And after the overhaul, after the shift to this PPP licensing model,
revenue skyrocketed to 6 million guan per year.
Wait, from 400,000 to 6 million?
A more than tenfold increase in just a few short years.
That's astonishing.
To put 6 million guan in context, at that time, that money was enough to fund the annual salary and maintenance of maybe 40 to 50,000 fully operational soldiers in the field, or to undertake massive rebuilding projects in the capital. It was real, immediate, desperately needed cash.
And this all happened before Yang Yan's long-term land tax reform. The two-tax system was even fully functional.
Yes. For a critical period right after the rebellion, historians estimate that salt profit accounted for half the total national income.
Half of the entire government's budget from one commodity.
Half. Court expenditures, military spending, official salaries, the entire functioning of the reorganized state after the chaos of the Aleutian Rebellion was dependent on this single income stream.
So the two-tax system was the long-term stable diet, but Liu Yan's salt reform was the emergency relief that stopped the financial bleeding and ensured the dynasty survived the trauma.
It was the medicinal cure. And it proved that the empire didn't have to choose between massive revenue and operational efficiency. They could outsource the efficiency to the private sector while retaining control over the revenue flow. And that lesson was not lost on later dynasties. They studied this blueprint like a sacred text.
So if you're a later monarch and you're studying how the mighty Tang managed to survive its biggest existential crisis, you would immediately identify Liu Yan's salt reform as the most flexible, most powerful tool for dealing with financial emergencies.
It's remarkable. I mean, a system designed in the 8th century was still being adapted and relied upon 1,000 years later. Its true legacy is its adaptability to changing crises. It became the imperial treasury's dedicated fund for defense.
Let's start with the Song Dynasty. They faced existential defense threats that were maybe even worse than what the Tang faced. They were under constant, severe pressure from large-scale foreign invasions, the Liao, the Jin.
And their standard revenue from the two-tax system was just never going to be enough to fund the massive defensive machine they needed.
So they turned to salt.
They turned to salt. The songmasters understood the flexibility of the three methods: monopoly, licensing, taxation. They used them all regionally, but they relied heavily on a really sophisticated version of Liu Yan's licensing system. They called it the banknote salt system, or Dryanzi.
The banknote salt system. This sounds like a brilliant move for rapid cash flow. How did it work?
It was essentially a system of pre-sold revenue. So a private merchant had to purchase a license, which was a document, sometimes called a salt voucher or a banknote, from the government first, using cash.
So the government gets the cash up front.
Immediately. And only after securing that valuable voucher could the merchant then travel to the government depot, buy the actual salt, and then go sell it within their designated territory.
That's so smart. It's essential for immediate military needs, for paying troops. They couldn't wait for land taxes to be harvested and collected months down the line.
Not at all.
Yeah.
Military campaigns are expensive and they are time sensitive. The banknote salt system secured a constant, reliable source of revenue, second only to the two-tax system. And it was perfectly designed to fund those constant border conflicts.
But the evolution didn't stop there, did it? As the threats changed, the system had to change.
It had to. Which brings us to the Ming Dynasty, established centuries later. The primary threat shifted again. Now, it was focused heavily on that long, unforgiving northern border against the Mongols.
And that requires not just cash, but massive, rapid logistical support to supply all those remote border garrisons.
Logistics are exponentially expensive and difficult in a pre-industrial era. I mean, especially over these vast distances of hostile terrain. So the Ming developed something called the Kaizhan method, the Kaizhanfa, which effectively turned the salt license into a logistical defense bond.
A defense bond? How did that work?
The mechanism was ingenious. Merchants didn't pay the government in cash, at least not initially. Instead, they delivered essential supplies, mostly grain, but also military material, construction resources, directly to the remote northern defense strongholds.
Wait, so the merchants themselves were responsible for the entire complex supply chain of delivering grain to the frontier. That's an enormous risk and a huge logistical investment for them.
It was a massive risk. But the reward was immense, because in exchange for that verified delivery of grain, they received the valuable salt voucher, the license.
And that license gave them the right to buy salt cheaply from a state depot, probably in a much richer, more populated area.
Exactly. Often in the lucrative coastal regions where they could sell it at a massive profit.
That's fascinating. So the state needs food and supplies at the frontier right now, but it lacks the capacity and the capital to transport it all there. So by granting this incredibly valuable salt franchise, they leverage private merchant capital and logistics networks to achieve their immediate military goals.
It effectively weaponized the salt license. It became a form of defense bond or a material IOU. And it achieved this rapid, massive infusion of logistical support that the regular land tax just could not cover in real time. This mechanism supported huge, crucial conflicts that were far beyond the scope of normal fiscal management.
But I imagine a system like the Kaizhong method also had some inherent weaknesses. I mean, merchants are traveling these incredibly long distances. The value of that salt license has to stay consistently high to offset the huge risks and costs of transportation.
That's exactly right. And over time, the system became bloated. The merchants became too powerful. Some started delivering poor quality grain or just outright defrauding the system.
Of course.
And what's more, as the security situation on the frontier got worse, those long delivery routes became too dangerous. The logistical cost went up, and the merchants' willingness to even participate in the Kaisang system started to go down.
So the risk started to outweigh the reward, which means the government is suddenly facing a shortage of supplies at the border.
Yes. So during the critical Wanli era of the Ming, the treasury was running dry, and they needed pure cash again, not grain IOUs. So the system pivoted away from that logistical trade-off and toward maximizing immediate high-volume cash revenue.
And that's when they shifted to the gang salt system, the gangyanzi.
Right. And this was the opposite of the broad-based system that Liu Yan had envisioned. It granted an exclusive, often inheritable monopoly privilege to a very small, very powerful group of extremely wealthy salt merchants, an oligarchy.
An inheritable oligopoly. Why would they introduce such an exclusionary and, frankly, potentially corrupt system?
Because that privilege was so valuable, a guaranteed, inheritable, massive monopoly over a vital commodity, these few wealthy merchants were willing to pay astronomical upfront sums for the licenses.
Ah, so it was an emergency cash grab.
It was the ultimate emergency cash grab. It secured massive amounts of silver from Ming military expenditures precisely when they needed it most. The state basically traded broad participation for massive, quick infusions of capital from the deep pockets of the few.
This model of granting massive inheritable privileges in exchange for emergency cash, this leads us directly into the Qing Dynasty, right? They initially continued this exclusive gang salt system.
They did, and the inevitable problems of an oligopoly came right back. The closed nature of the system led to severe corruption and stagnation. Because the group of eligible merchants was so limited and their licenses were inheritable, they just got complacent.
And powerful.
and powerful. They were often reluctant to buy more licenses or pay higher prices because they knew the state had very few other options for buyers. So the state's potential salt profit actually started to shrink just when the king budgets were facing massive pressure from internal unrest and external threats.
So the state needed to introduce competition again to drive up license prices and efficiency.
Exactly. So during the Daoguang era of the king, they implemented the ticket salt system, or Piyanzi, particularly in the very lucrative Huai River region.
How did the ticket system differ from the gang system?
It just opened up the license purchases to other private merchants for money. It replaced that exclusive inherited gang structure with a more open, more competitive ticket system.
So it was a move back toward Liu Yan's original concept.
It was. It was about leveraging broad private participation for state profit. It addressed the corruption, it maximized the sales volume of licenses, and it ensured the government was maximizing revenue by increasing competition among the buyers.
This constant back and forth really shows the state was always tweaking the dials, right?
Yeah.
Choosing between maximizing immediate cash flow, like with the gang system, or maximizing long-term efficiency and competition, like with the ticket system, or Liu Yan's original model.
And the final, ultimate evolution of this system takes us into the early 20th century. With the fall of the empire and the rise of the Beiyang government, here we see the complete move away from all these complex monopolies and licensing models, and a final shift to that pure taxation system we talked about, the Zhengshuizi.
Why could they finally abandon the control mechanism that had defined salt profit for 1,000 years? What changed?
Well, this transition was only possible because, by the 20th century, the state's administrative capacity had finally caught up. Their tax collection agencies had developed significantly, their record keeping was more robust, and their enforcement capacity had improved dramatically.
So they could finally just efficiently monitor and collect a tax without having to go through the immense, complicated logistics of controlling the supply chain and buying and reselling the salt themselves.
Right. They could just let the private market handle everything and collect a tax on the sales.
And how did that work out?
Allowing open private trade and simply collecting a dedicated tax proved to be the most efficient and transparent way to extract salt profit. It became the second largest source of income for the government at that time, only after customs duties.
Wow.
Yeah. The long history of it all shows that the taxation system, which was built on robust state capacity and open private operation, was really the final, most sustainable form of the salt profit.
Let's go back to the incredible political irony we started with. Because this fiscal blueprint, it transcends the bitter rivalry that created it. Chancellor Wang Yan orchestrated the execution of his political rival, Minister Liu Yan.
His bitter rival.
And yet, not even Wang Yan, the man who murdered the architect, dared to dismantle the reformed salt administration system.
And that is the ultimate proof of its fiscal value. It didn't matter who was in power or what the crisis was. The established salt licensing system became the imperial treasury's most flexible, most powerful tool for defense funding across the millennium.
It was the ancient equivalent of a dedicated, high-yield oil revenue stream that could be instantly leveraged for massive, unexpected infusions of cash during a crisis.
It perfectly supplemented the normal, stable land and poll tax revenues. And it provided the capacity for that urgent high-volume income needed to fight wars, survive rebellions, and manage these monumental logistical tasks, like supplying a frontier army. That is the true definition of life-saving money.
We've really seen 1,000 years of strategic financial warfare fought using salt as the primary weapon.
We have confirmed how Liu Yan transformed an inefficient state commodity into the most potent source of flexible revenue in imperial history. It was a blueprint that lasted until the fall of the empire.
And we clarified the paradox at its heart. It was morally complicated. An undeniably regressive tax that hit the poor hardest and earned the moral condemnation of scholars for centuries.
But it was fiscally essential for state survival. It funded defense and stability when every other system failed.
And the underlying mechanism of the reform, it remains powerful. Identifying a commodity with low elasticity and geographically centralized production, and then structuring a public-private partnership around its bottleneck to maximize state revenue and private efficiency.
The ultimate takeaway is that the empire needed instant cash flow for defense, and it found that cash flow not by inventing new taxes, but by inventing a new, more efficient way to monetize an existing necessity.
So, if you were transported back to ancient times, or even today, and you were tasked with improving national revenue without unjustly burdening the populace. A noble but very difficult goal. What other universally needed commodity, something with low elasticity and centralized production, would you target for a similar revolutionary public-private partnership reform today?
What would be your life-saving money?
Imagine a world power back in the 11th century, a nation so financially dominant that if you could somehow look at its balance sheets.
Which would have been on scrolls, not spreadsheets.
Right. If you could look at those, you'd see its annual state income made the vast Spanish Empire at its 16th century peak look. Well, it would look like a local corner store in comparison.
We're talking about revenues that were 5, maybe even 6 times greater than enormous later dynasties. Look at the king.
Exactly. Yet this same nation, this absolute financial engine of the world, was constantly losing territory.
Constantly. It was militarily outclassed, forced into these humiliating and often very expensive treaties.
And ultimately, despite all that incredible wealth, it just collapsed.
That is the paradox. That is the mind-bending puzzle we are diving into today. How can a state be the commercial engine of its era, generating wealth that's almost impossible to comprehend, and yet still be seen as perpetually weak?
So our mission today is to really get inside the Song Dynasty. It's the story of a financial titan that, basically invented concepts of modern money and markets.
But was caught in this profound strategic trap. We have to explore why all of that commercial wealth, all that innovation, failed to secure the nation's survival.
It led to this haunting internal description of its own condition. They called it accumulated poverty and weakness.
Ji-pin-ji-ru.
That phrase itself is such a puzzle, isn't it? Accumulated poverty. Before the song, the standard wisdom, and not just in China, but really across most ancient civilizations, was simple, and it was rigid.
It was the principle of revere agriculture, suppress commerce, Zhongnangishan.
And the concept was basically that true, stable wealth, it comes from the land. Land doesn't move. You can tax a harvest reliably year after year.
Exactly. For centuries, it didn't matter if you were talking about the Roman Empire or previous Chinese dynasties or medieval Europe. Power was measured in grain and acres. Commerce was necessary, sure, but it was seen as fluid, unstable, and frankly, a bit morally suspect.
So historically, imperial dynasties would only get a tiny trickle of their revenue from taxing merchants. The backbone of the state was always the farmer.
Always. But the Song Dynasty, they just radically inverted this entire equation. They were the great historical outlier, the black swan.
They decided that fluidity, that very instability, was a feature, not a bug.
And they built such a sophisticated system around it that for the first time in imperial history, their fiscal revenue from commercial taxes, it actually exceeded the revenue they collected from the good old traditional land taxes.
It's almost impossible to overstate what a seismic shift that was. This wasn't just, a tax reform. It was a complete philosophical revolution in how you run a state.
A total paradigm shift.
So let's talk about that phrase, Ji-pin-ji-ro, accumulated poverty and weakness.
Yeah.
Later historians used it a lot, often to criticize the song. And we have to tackle that poor label head on because it just doesn't seem to match the fiscal reality you just described.
It doesn't. Not at all. Now, when historians called the Song Dynasty weak, they were measuring it against these, territorial giants of the past, like the Han Dynasty or the incredibly expansive Tang.
Right. The Song failed to recover lost northern territories. And they were losing ground continuously and often humiliatingly to these external forces.
The Khitan Liao, the Tangut Western Xia, the Jurchen Jin, and then, the final cataclysmic sweep of the Mongols. So
yeah,
from a strategic, a geopolitical standpoint, yes, they were undeniably weak in terms of military dominance.
But financially, when you actually audit the accounts, they were anything but poor.
Anything but. They had commercial prosperity on a scale that wasn't matched anywhere else on the planet at that time. They had an incredibly sophisticated economic structure. We're talking fiat currency, bills of exchange, and a taxation network that delivered fiscal revenue far, far beyond any other dynasty for hundreds of years.
It was like the Song Dynasty was a financial giant wearing paper armor.
That is the perfect analogy. And that distinction, unbelievable wealth without dominant military power, is the critical dynamic here. It seems like a contradiction to us today, but history actually gives us a really clear, relatable parallel to help us grasp this.
Okay, so where do we look?
Let's look west for a moment. Let's shift our gaze to the 17th century Dutch Republic during its golden age.
Ah, okay. The masters of trade.
Exactly.
Right.
The Dutch Republic was, without any question, the wealthiest, most commercially advanced nation in Europe. They were the master financial engineers, running global trade routes, inventing modern banking, pioneering new forms of investment.
But what happened when the big land-based giants like France or their big naval rivals like England came knocking with huge armies?
Well, that's the thing. The Dutch often had to rely on these complex, very expensive alliances. They were rich enough to fund global ventures and buy influence, sure, but they simply couldn't afford to field the massive, permanent land-based standing armies you needed to dominate continental Europe. They couldn't secure their borders against neighbors with huge populations and vast territories.
And the Song Dynasty faced this exact same strategic problem, just scaled up tenfold.
Precisely. Their wealth was commercial, it was fluid, it was leveraged. They were rich enough to buy off their enemies with huge annual tributes.
Like paying the Khitan a massive yearly subsidy just to keep a fragile and frankly humiliating peace.
They could afford survival, but they couldn't afford total victory or sustained territorial dominance. And that is a huge, huge difference.
We should probably connect the dots on how that wealth was actually used too. You mentioned leveraging wealth.
Yes. The Song, just like the Dutch would later, they became masters of credit and financial tools. It wasn't just about having piles of cash. They developed the world's first paper money, the jiaozi and huizi.
Which let them mobilize enormous funds very, very quickly.
Exactly. For those urgent military needs or those massive annual tribute payments, they could project financial strength far beyond their physical reserves of metal coin. But that strength was fundamentally, and this is the key, it was based on the continuous health of their commercial markets.
Which raises the central question that's going to define this whole deep dive, right? If the Song were generating revenue on this absolutely unprecedented scale, if they were so financially savvy, why couldn't they permanently change their weak status?
Why did they become so dependent on just paying off their enemies? And why, in the end, did they fall? The answer is rooted in how they built that engine and what it cost them to keep it running.
So to understand that immense cost, we first have to appreciate the sheer scale of their success. And to visualize the intoxicating level of prosperity, there's really no better guide than that famous painting along the river during the Qingming Festival.
Ah, the Qingming Shanghi too. It's a time machine on a scroll.
It really is. I mean, you look at it and you see these intricate bridges, bustling city streets, shops that are stacked high with goods from all over the empire. The river is just teeming with barges. It's a vision of urban complexity.
A metropolitan reality that people in 11th century Europe, well, they just couldn't have comprehended it. It feels less like ancient history and more like a vibrant, complex 19th century city.
And that prosperity, it was driven by a lot of things. New technologies, new rice strains that allowed for multiple harvests, the spread of printing. But the foundational shift, the thing that made it all possible, was the government's pro-business policy. And they implemented it right from the very beginning.
And this is so important. The policy didn't begin by celebrating merchants. That would have been too radical, too big a leap.
Right, they eased into it.
They eased into it. It began subtly. With agricultural reform, the state fundamentally changed its relationship with land. They issued a policy, it sounds a little dry, but it was revolutionary. Do not establish a fixed land system. Do not suppress land mergers.
Yeah. Okay, so break that down. What does that actually mean in practice?
It's crucial. Before this, emperors often tried to redistribute land to small farmers. The idea was to ensure everyone had enough acreage to pay their land taxes directly to the state. It was a mechanism for control, for stability.
But the Song changed this.
They did. Building on the two-tax law from the late Tang Dynasty, taxes were now based on the acreage being cultivated, regardless of who actually owned it. The Song government essentially said, we're getting out of the way of land accumulation.
And what did that do?
It instantly turned land into a tradable commodity, just like silk or tea or porcelain. It could be freely bought, sold, mortgaged.
That feels revolutionary because it must have freed up a huge amount of capital and labor.
Exactly. Rich landowners could now consolidate massive tracts of land, introduce more specialized, more profitable farming techniques, and then just hire tenant farmers to do the work.
And the small farmer, who was no longer tied strictly to their little subsistence plot,
They could move to the city. Or they could specialize in cash crops that were suddenly valuable on this new emerging national market.
so you start to see this explosion of regional specialization.
Yes. Rice cultivation skyrockets in the south. Textiles and silk production start booming in certain provinces. This incredibly intense commercial atmosphere, starting at the agricultural level, it created this massive, hungry internal market for consumer goods and for trade. It was the bedrock of everything that followed.
And once that agricultural foundation was set, the government started taking these huge, really progressive steps to actively elevate the social status of merchants.
A group that, as we said, had been actively suppressed and frankly discriminated against for millennia.
They started by abolishing the explicit, demeaning, discriminatory policies against merchants. Historically, merchants were forbidden from wearing silk clothes or riding horses or driving fine carriages, all those symbols of elite status.
All gone. In the song, those restrictions just vanished. Merchants could live like the wealthy people they actually were.
And then the gates of social mobility were just thrown wide open.
This is the big one. Merchants' descendants were allowed to take the rigorous civil service exams.
The ultimate path to power.
The ultimate door opener in ancient Chinese society. It proved that your family's wealth, your commercial success, was now a viable path to real power, not just your scholarly lineage.
The social stigma didn't just fade away, did it? It actually reversed.
It completely reversed. We see evidence that official, powerful scholar gentry families started to take pride in marrying their sons to the daughters of extremely wealthy merchant families. They were directly integrating commercial power into the highest levels of the elite social structure.
So the state didn't just tolerate merchants anymore. They started treating them like essential national infrastructure.
They did. They formally affirmed that merchants were vital for circulating goods for the country. And by doing that, they placed them conceptually, at least alongside the traditional four people, the scholars, the farmers, the artisans.
That's a complete philosophical and political pivot. They're recognizing that commercial contribution is vital to the nation.
And they backed that affirmation up by systematically dismantling the old, crippling restrictions on trade. A huge one was abolishing the rigid walled market system, the fang shy of the Tang Dynasty.
Remind us how that worked.
Under the Tang, trade was a very regulated, institutionalized affair. It was confined to fixed times and fixed places, often literally behind city walls. The market opened at a certain hour and closed at a certain hour.
And the song just said.
The song simply proclaimed, trade is completely opened up.
Yeah.
If you want to sell goods at midnight on a small side street, go for it. This led to this vibrant 247 economic activity in the cities.
They also systematically opened up traditionally state-run economic opportunities to the private sector.
Right. Think about the key revenue generators of any pre-modern state. Mining, tea, and especially salt. These had always been fiercely guarded state monopolies.
And under the song.
They were opened up for private operation, or, more commonly, through these new joint government-merchant partnerships. The state was basically inviting the private sector to use its capital and its efficiency to power the economy.
While the state guaranteed the profits and, crucially, took a very healthy cut.
Of course. But, open markets need confidence. And confidence requires predictability. It requires the rule of law.
And the founding emperor, Song Dynasty, he understood this very deeply. Right at the start, in 960, he issued the landmark commercial tax regulations.
This was so crucial for creating a systematic, predictable environment. The regulations explicitly forbade local officials from arbitrarily increasing taxes on merchants, or worse, harassing them and just seizing their profits on a whim.
So merchants knew the rules of the game. They knew their capital was protected,
which incentivized long-term investment and long-distance trade. It was a game changer.
They also laid the fundamental groundwork for a truly national, interconnected market.
They took the massive administrative step of unifying weights and measures across the entire vast empire.
Which sounds boring, but it's essential. I mean, imagine trying to trade grain from the south to the north if every single region used a different unit of measure.
It would be a nightmare. Standardization makes trade efficient. And most fundamentally, they explicitly protected private property.
So you have unified standards and protected profits. Those are the two non-negotiable ingredients you need for a commercial explosion.
Absolutely. The Song government wasn't just benefiting from commerce. They were actively engineering its spectacular rise through very deliberate, systematic policy.
So we've established that the Song Dynasty was this self-made commercial superpower. They innovated their way out of that historical reliance on land. But let's circle back to the strategic why. I mean, why risk upending millennia of tradition to elevate commerce in the first place?
The answer, as we touched on earlier, is just raw, uncompromising national survival.
Right. The Song Dynasty was born into an incredibly hostile geopolitical environment.
Incredibly hostile. They were sandwiched between these powerful, militarily aggressive regimes like the Khitan and the Jurchen. They didn't have the luxury of easily defensible borders or, centuries of peace to build up their strength.
They knew they couldn't rely on the traditional conscripted farmer soldiers that earlier dynasties had used.
No, they needed a professional standing army, and they needed to equip that army with advanced weaponry like early forms of gunpowder. And all of that required unimaginable amounts of cash flow, year after year after year.
So to survive these existential threats, they had to condense their internal strength, which meant generating staggering revenue just to keep the nation from being overrun.
And this requirement led them to shoulder three massive fiscal burdens. These burdens were the black hole that sucked up all that incredible commercial wealth.
Okay, so let's break these down. What was the first burden?
The first burden was raising an army. And we are not talking about a small regional force. The Song Dynasty military often topped 1 million professional soldiers.
1 million? That's a number that would strain even a modern economy, let alone a pre-industrial state.
The scale of that military spending was just staggering. It covered not just the huge salaries for a permanent standing army, but also the constant logistics, the manufacturing of sophisticated weapons.
And, as we mentioned, those endless tribute payments required to placate their powerful northern neighbors.
The military budget was perpetually the single largest drain on the entire treasury, no question.
Okay, so that's burden one. What's the second?
The second burden was raising officials. The Song rulers had learned from the mistakes of the Tang dynasty.
Which had collapsed partly due to internal strife and disloyal regional governors.
Exactly. So to ensure the absolute loyalty of the intellectual class and prevent those internal fractures, they made government service incredibly comfortable and incredibly lucrative.
They treated their officials exceptionally well.
Exceptionally. And this wasn't just about high salaries. It included lavish benefits, housing, stipends, and enormous bonuses. The payroll for the bureaucracy was absolutely immense.
So it was a conscious trade-off. They were buying internal stability and loyalty by making government service too rewarding to betray.
They prioritized the unity of the elite above almost everything else.
Which brings us to the third burden, and this one is arguably the most fascinating and progressive.
It's raising the people. The state established what historians often describe as a cradle-to-grave welfare system, using fiscal funds for widespread social stability.
This was truly revolutionary for the time. We talk a lot about the financial scale of the military, but the social spending was equally consequential, wasn't it?
Absolutely. They funded state-run charities, orphanages, public cemeteries for the poor, and massive state granaries to ensure food security.
And we have specific examples of this, right? Like the state-run pharmacies, the Human Yaofeng.
Yes, which ensured that even the poor could access essential medicines at subsidized rates right across the empire. They organized vast, proactive famine relief efforts and undertook major public construction projects, like building massive bridges and water management systems to ensure public employment and well-being.
The goal here wasn't just kindness, though. It was insurance.
It was pure strategic insurance. They were actively investing in the well-being and the loyalty of the general populace to prevent the kind of civil unrest and peasant rebellions that had defined the collapse of so many prior dynasties.
So just to recap, the Song Dynasty was simultaneously running a massive social welfare state, a gargantuan military payroll, and an enormous, highly compensated civil service, all at the same time.
All at once. And this brings us right back to the original financial necessity. All three of these burdens required staggering, continuous amounts of hard cash. But the traditional land taxes, as we said, had already hit their ceiling by the year 995. They just couldn't squeeze any more reliable cash out of the agricultural base without risking a massive rebellion.
They needed a new, expandable financial engine. They needed a path where revenue growth wasn't finite, wasn't tied to how many acres of land you had.
And that path, of course, was taxing commerce.
By embracing and taxing the merchant class so heavily, the state effectively created what you could call a community of shared destiny.
That's a great way to put it. They became partners in survival. The state used the merchants' efficiency and capital to generate wealth, and in return, the state protected the markets and did its best to keep the external enemies at bay.
Okay, so how did they actually execute this taxation strategy? How did they achieve these dizzying revenue totals that were 5 or 6 times more than their successors? You said there were 2 main avenues.
2 brilliant main avenues. First, the fiercely controlled monopoly system, or JinQ, and second, the really thorough nationwide taxation of ordinary goods and transactions.
Let's dissect the monopolies first, because it sounds like this was the heart of the engine.
It was. The government wasn't just taxing goods here. They controlled the entire supply chain, from production to distribution for essential, high-demand, non-negotiable items.
And these were salt, tea, alcohol, and alum.
Yes, and from an economic and strategic standpoint, these were genius choices because they exploited a core economic principle: low price elasticity of demand.
Okay, translate that for us.
It means people need these things regardless of the price. People need salt to survive and to preserve food. They need alum for dyeing textiles and for tanning leather.
Yeah.
And, well, they want tea and alcohol.
So demand is consistent. It's inelastic.
It's very inelastic.
Yeah.
This allowed the state to introduce massive taxes or just artificially inflate the price through their monopoly control, and people would still buy it. It provided a guaranteed massive income stream for the state, rain or shine. The Song really mastered the art of taxing necessity.
And the enforcement of these monopolies was fierce, especially for salt. You called salt revenue the secret sauce.
It was the secret sauce that propelled the Song past every other dynasty financially. The income from the salt monopoly alone was often roughly equal to, or sometimes it even exceeded, the entire revenue generated by the traditional land tax.
That's incredible, just from salt.
Just from salt. And to enforce this, they established specialized government agencies and cracked down incredibly hard on private salt trading, or what they called smuggling, which was a capital offense. They essentially turned a basic human need into a continuous stream of gold for the imperial treasury.
And as the empire was later pushed south by the Jurchen, when we get to the southern Song Dynasty, the strategic emphasis had to shift, didn't it?
It did. And they discovered an even bigger source of fluid wealth: maritime trade.
The sea lanes.
They became an absolute magnet for global trade, particularly with Arab merchants and traders from Southeast Asia who were bringing in these incredibly valuable luxury goods and, critically, spices. Spices like pepper and cloves, who were the oil of the ancient world. Low bulk, very high value.
And the government expertly leveraged this explosion.
Oh, completely. They established customs agencies in key port cities like Guangzhou, which became one of the world's largest and busiest ports. The income they generated from customs duties and the mandatory purchase of foreign trade licenses was just staggering.
And this revenue stream became a lifeline for the southern Song.
An absolute lifeline. It was crucial. It acted as this massive financial injection that prevented the financial collapse of the smaller, territorially constrained state, while it was under relentless military pressure. The wealth was flowing directly from the global sea lanes right into the national treasury.
Okay, so that's the monopolies. Now for the second avenue, the comprehensive taxation of ordinary, everyday goods.
Right, and this is where the sheer breadth and depth of the Song system becomes so apparent. They didn't rely on sporadic collections. They built a deep, penetrating commercial tax network that permeated the entire society.
So tax agencies were set up everywhere.
Everywhere, not just in the capital, but in every major city, every regional market, even in large villages. Almost every transaction, every movement of goods was tracked and it was taxed. They were ensuring maximum coverage across that vast internal market they'd created.
Can we get into the specific types of taxes they used?
We can. There was a passing tax, which was essentially a toll or a customs duty. It was levied at checkpoints whenever goods were transported across administrative boundaries, like crossing a bridge or entering a new prefecture. Basically, if your goods moved, they were taxed.
Okay, what else?
Then you have the residence tax. You can think of this as a business license fee or a kind of sales tax that was applied to shopkeepers and resident merchants who were operating permanent businesses in towns. It was a consistent, reliable fee, often based on their sales volume or just the size of their operation.
And there was a third major one, right? The contract tax?
Yes, and this was crucial. This was a tax levied on all property transactions, whether for houses, land, or other major assets.
And this tax on real estate served multiple purposes. It wasn't just about income.
No, it was a significant source of income, for sure. But it also acted as a mechanism for the state to track and to regulate the booming urban property markets. You could even see it as an early version of a stamp duty, or maybe a small check on property speculation in those rapidly expanding cities.
So all of these pervasive mechanisms, they added up to what can only be described as a financial behemoth.
That's the only word for it. Let's talk scale, because this is the moment where we move from historical curiosity to just genuine awe.
Lay it on us.
The historian Wang calculated the Song Dynasty's annual fiscal revenue during normal years at over 150 million strings of copper cash.
Which, when you convert it to the standard metric of silver, is roughly equivalent to 150 million taels of silver.
150 million. Now let's put that number into perspective for you. The later, territorially vast Ming Dynasty and the expansive early Qing Dynasty empires that lasted for centuries and governed far larger populations, their total annual revenues typically hovered somewhere under 30 million taels.
So the Song Dynasty's commercial engine was generating 5 to 6 times the total revenue of the mighty Qing Dynasty centuries later, despite having a much smaller geographical footprint.
It's an explosive differential. It's almost unbelievable.
And if we look across the globe for a comparison,
Let's consider the peak financial output of the Spanish Empire.
Ah.
Even with all the gold and silver flowing in from the Americas on those famous treasure fleets, the combined royal revenues of Spain were often less than a third of this Song figure.
So this is why we can confidently say the Song Dynasty wasn't just rich for its time. It was unequivocally a global financial superpower.
Absolutely. They had solved the age-old problem of how to fund a massive imperial state in a way no one else on Earth had yet matched. They had the money, they had the credit, and they had the system.
And now the story takes its tragic turn because the very success of this commercial tax system, the thing that sustained the Song against incredible external pressure for centuries, it ultimately created a fatal dependency that led to its internal collapse.
Military defeat was just the final consequence. The fiscal system had already failed from within.
And the collapse of that system, the thing that was supposed to save them, shockingly, traces right back to the commercial tax itself. Why, I mean, if they were so financially advanced, why couldn't they just innovate their way past this? Couldn't technology have saved them?
And that is the absolute core tragedy of the Song Dynasty. We have to remember the economic and the technological limitations of the era. No matter how advanced the Song's commerce was, with their paper money and bills of exchange and sophisticated trade routes, it was still fundamentally an agricultural society. It was pre-industrial revolution.
So the quantity of goods available for profitable trade and therefore available for taxation was ultimately finite.
It was finite. You're running a Formula One engine in a world that was built for ox carts. The speed of the engine is limited by the quality of the fuel and the road surface.
So the entire commercial tax system relied on one thing: merchants making a profit. When economic activity shrunk because of war or external blockades or internal distress,
The tax revenue shrunk immediately and steeply. The system simply hit its natural ceiling. They couldn't magically generate more silk or more salt than the available labor and resources allowed for.
and history confirms this hard limit, doesn't it?
It does. Despite repeated efforts by reforming officials to increase tax rates or find new items to tax, the actual revenue just stopped growing robustly after the mid-Song Dynasty period. It plateaued.
And by the late Southern Song, especially after losing all that territory to the Jurchen, many of the geographically specific revenue streams must have dried up.
They did. The lucrative salt profit was virtually the only reliable monopoly income they had left. The others were drying up or just becoming too difficult and too expensive to enforce. The commercial tax had reached its practical limit of extraction. It was enough for maintenance, but it wasn't enough for the growth they needed to fund those three ever-expanding burdens.
So when the commercial tax plateaued and it couldn't meet the ever-increasing demands of the army, the officials, and the welfare system, the state was forced to revert to the only other reliable asset it had.
The land. They fell right back into the old trap.
This is the dependency trap. The wealth they generated led to military and welfare commitments that only more wealth could sustain. And when the commercial growth stopped, the commitments were still there.
So they had to start adding heavy surcharges to the land tax. These taxes often went by these, euphemistic names, but they were essentially just additional levies on the farmers.
And this pressure must have been particularly intense in the Southern Song. Their territory was shrinking dramatically, but their need for military funds to fight the Jurchen and later the Mongols was mounting exponentially.
Yes, the central government became desperate for funds, and so they pushed that increasing financial burden and the responsibility for collection down onto local officials. And those local officials, knowing the central government wouldn't object as long as the cash kept flowing.
They squeezed the very people who were supposed to be the bedrock of the empire, the peasants.
The peasantry was absolutely crushed under the weight of exorbitant miscellaneous taxes. Petty fees, regional levies, surcharges piled on top of their original, already high land tax burden.
And this internal squeeze, combined with the inevitable destructive corruption at the local level,
where officials used the system's desperation to enrich themselves. It made the rural populace destitute. The empire, in its desperate Faustian quest for revenue, was actively destroying its own foundational stability.
It was the ultimate Faustian bargain. The immense commercial wealth bought them immediate survival against powerful external enemies for 3 centuries.
But the heavy taxation required to generate that wealth ultimately crushed the very people who sustained it. It caused the internal collapse that made them so susceptible to the final Mongol conquest.
The Great Song Empire rose by the commercial tax.
And it tragically fell by the commercial tax. Its own financial genius was the source of its ruin.
So to recap this central tragedy, the Song Dynasty successfully implemented the most progressive, the most financially brilliant fiscal strategy in imperial history. They created unprecedented national wealth, and they sustained themselves against overwhelming geopolitical odds, becoming the financial superpower of their age.
But because they were entirely dependent on a single, albeit highly developed, but ultimately finite revenue source, pre-industrial commerce, when that system hit its natural economic limit, the state was trapped. It was forced to devour its own agricultural base, which led to widespread misery and the collapse of internal stability.
The lesson for us today is pretty striking, and it feels highly relevant. I mean, think about any modern nation that relies entirely or even just heavily on a single revenue source. For a single export commodity, be it oil, the specific technology sector, or a highly centralized tax structure.
When global demand shifts, or when that resource hits its natural economic or technological limit, just as the song's pre-industrial commercial revenue eventually did, the foundation gives way. The government, unable to meet its vast obligations for military welfare bureaucracy, it has to find increasingly desperate, self-destructive ways to fill that resulting hole.
Even the best, most progressive economic strategy, if it's fundamentally unmatched by the geopolitical environment and the technological ceiling of its time, it just can't guarantee long-term stability. The Song Dynasty's genius for finance was simply born a few centuries too soon.
Which leaves us with this provocative closing question. What modern nation today, despite its apparent wealth, relies so heavily on one primary fiscal engine, be it a resource, a sector, or even a tax structure built on a specific economic model, that its long-term stability is secretly compromised? What is our era's commercial tax trap? Every government, really since the dawn of civilization, has had to face this one, just, unavoidable truth. You need money to rule, and that money, it has to come from somewhere.
And that somewhere is always ultimately the people. It's the ultimate political tightrope walk.
Totally.
You know, you have to fund the army, you have to build roads, maintain order. But if you push people too far on taxes, you get a revolt.
Right.
There's that brutal quote from the French finance minister, Jean-Baptiste Colbert. He said, "The art of taxation consists in so plucking the goose as to obtain the largest possible amount of feathers with the smallest possible amount of hissing."
I love that quote. It's so visceral. It just perfectly captures the brutal necessity of it, but also the huge political risk.
Yeah.
But here's the paradox we're diving into today. Just imagine trying to do that silent plucking in a massive pre-modern agrarian empire.
1,000 years ago.
1,000 years ago, and oh, by the way, you're facing a bankruptcy crisis.
It sounds completely impossible. I mean, most imperial history is just a story of static extraction.
What do you mean by that?
Just reaching deeper and deeper into the same pockets. But during the Northern Song Dynasty in 11th century China, this one figure emerges who just rejects that entire idea. The reformer, Anshi.
Wang Anshi. And he comes forward with a promise that must have sounded like pure fantasy to the court at the time.
Absolutely.
And honestly, it still sounds pretty revolutionary today. He claimed he could fix the state's massive deficit without raising a single tax rate on the common person.
His central promise was so simple, but just so audacious. The people are not taxed more, yet the state's revenue is abundant.
It sounds like a magic trick.
It does. And he wasn't talking about, little cuts here and there. He was proposing a fundamental, radical overhaul of the entire system. The goal was to make the whole economy bigger.
And his mission statement was just crystal clear, right?
A rich country and a strong army. The Song Dynasty, it was a cultural powerhouse, but militarily, financially, it was bleeding out. Wang Anji saw that without a healthy economy, the whole empire was just doomed.
Okay, so here's the core tension we're getting into. Most historians, they agree, right? Wang Anshi's reform was an institutional failure, a disaster in how it was carried out.
A complete disaster. But to just stop there is to miss the entire point.
Right.
We have to look past the failure to see the sheer stunning significance of the ideas he was trying to put into place.
And that's our mission for this deep dive. We're moving beyond that simple historical verdict of, success or failure. We want to understand how this radical, almost futuristic attempt at financial surgery was even conceived in the first place. This wasn't just reform, it was like an ultra-modern blueprint dropped into a medieval world.
Okay, so let's unpack his central innovation. It all comes down to 4 words. Dongtai Shengsai?
Dynamic wealth generation.
Dynamic wealth generation.
That sounds like a slogan from a Silicon Valley startup, not an 11th century ministry. What was the old way of thinking he was fighting against?
The old way was what we'd call static extraction. So think about that goose again, the tax base. In an agrarian economy, the pool of wealth is pretty much fixed from year to year, right? If your total harvest is, say, 1,000 bushels of grain and the state needs more money.
The only thing you can do is take a bigger percentage.
Exactly. You just raise the tax rate from 10% to 15%. You're just extracting a larger piece from a static, unchanging pool.
Which, going back to the quote, causes a lot more hissing.
A lot more. It breeds resentment. It encourages officials to get corrupt. And a lot of the time, it just crashes the very economy you're trying to tax. It's a zero-sum game.
So Wang Anshi just flipped that whole idea on its head.
Completely. He didn't want to just extract more from the existing pie. He wanted the state to actively step in to generate new economic value.
So he wanted to use the government's power to actually grow the total size of the economy. That way the state's slice, even at the same percentage, would just be bigger in absolute terms.
That's it, precisely. His goal was to create entirely new streams of revenue without putting a heavier relative burden on the people. And this is why his whole system looks so modern. Well, if you look at his policies through the lens of modern finance, he basically pioneered 4 different ways of generating wealth dynamically that are, well, they're staples of state policy today.
It's like finding a 21st century economics textbook in an 11th century library.
It really is.
Okay, let's break these down. Let's start with the most foundational one. Pathway number 1, developing production.
This one sounds intuitive now, but for a state that usually only focused on collecting taxes, it was revolutionary. The concept is simple. Infrastructure investment.
You build productive things, you grow the economy.
Right. And his big law for this was the agricultural water conservation law, the Non-Kai and Shuli Fa.
And this wasn't just, encouraging farmers to dig a few wells. This was a massive, state-led, nationally coordinated project.
Absolutely. The law was about the state pouring money into building and maintaining irrigation, canals, flood control systems, but also promoting new farming tech.
And it wasn't a charity project.
Not at all. The funding mechanism was key. Local communities had to repay the government's investment over time through their taxes, but, and this is the genius part, it was based on the increased output that the new irrigation provided.
So the state is acting like a venture capitalist.
Exactly.
It fronts the huge initial cost, and then it gets a share of the returns created by that new infrastructure.
Yeah.
That is pure dynamic wealth generation.
It is. And the scale of this thinking is just, it's huge. Think about President Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal.
Okay.
Specifically, think about the Tennessee Valley Authority, the TVA.
Right. The massive dam projects.
The TVA built those huge dams and completely transformed a whole region of the country that was economically depressed.
It solved the constant flooding. It provided cheap electricity. It boosted farm output across, 7 states?
Yes. That wasn't static extraction. That was government-driven, long-term economic growth.
And that's what Wang Anshi was trying to do.
It's exactly what he was trying to do. He saw that state spending, if you target it strategically at things that boost productivity, like water control, it becomes an engine for economic growth. The state profits from a bigger, healthier tax base, and the people profit from bigger harvests and more stability.
It's just stunning to think that an 11th century statesman was already seeing infrastructure spending as a key to long-term fiscal health. But that's just one piece. How do you make the existing systems, labor and commerce, more efficient?
That brings us right to pathway 2, optimizing transactions.
Boy.
This is all about efficiency and a principle we now call comparative advantage. Wang Anshi realized that these rigid, one-size-fits-all government rules were just wasting enormous economic potential.
So he wanted to replace them with, market-based ideas.
Early market mechanisms, exactly.
And the 2 big laws here were the service exemption law, the Miani Fei, and the horse breeding law, the Bama Fei.
Yeah.
Okay, let's start with the Miani Fei, the service exemption law. So traditionally, every man had to do mandatory labor for the state, corvée labor.
And that system was an absolute disaster for the economy.
How so?
Well, imagine you're a highly skilled silk weaver or a really productive farmer. Suddenly, you're pulled away from your work for 3 months to go haul rocks for a new government building.
It's incredibly disruptive.
You lose 3 months of your most productive work, and the government gets, well, slow, unhappy, unmotivated labor. Everybody loses.
So what did his law do?
The service exemption law let people pay a fee, it was calculated based on their wealth, to get out of doing this mandatory service. The government then took all that money it collected,
And hired professionals?
then hired professional full-time laborers to do the public work.
That's just genius in its simplicity.
It is.
The farmer, who's better at farming, stays on the farm and makes the most money he can. The laborer, who's better at building things, gets a professional wage for doing the work well.
And the state gets more tax revenue from the productive farmer and better, faster public works. It's a win-win-win. It's a profound attempt to bring market outsourcing into government.
Right. It shifted the whole cost of public works from this, destructive labor tax to a rational cash transaction. It freed everyone up to focus on what they do best.
It's treating labor not as an obligation, but as a resource that you have to allocate efficiently.
Okay, so did that same idea of comparative advantage apply to the horse breeding law?
Absolutely. The old imperial system, it meant the government had to run these huge, expensive, bureaucratic pastures to raise horses for the military.
And I'm guessing that didn't work very well.
It was notoriously corrupt, incredibly expensive, and it produced terrible horses. Just awful.
Which is a huge problem since horses were critical for the Song military.
So Wang Anshi basically said, why are we, the government, so bad at this business? Instead of running these failing government pastures, the state started to subsidize private citizens in the border regions to raise the horses instead.
So outsourcing again?
The state still technically owned the horse, but the citizen was paid to raise it and train it.
You're giving the job to the experts.
Yeah.
I mean, the private citizens were better equipped, they were more motivated, they lived right there by the grazing lands.
Right. And the state gets to slash its administrative costs and gets better military horses in the end. It's just pure economic optimization.
So Pathway 2 is all about swapping out these clunky administrative commands for kind of calculated cash incentives.
Using the market. It's a clear statement that the government's job is to regulate and incentivize, not necessarily to do every single task itself.
This is starting to sound less like an old agrarian empire and more like, I don't know, a proto-mercantile state.
It is.
Which brings us to Pathway 3, which sounds like the riskiest one of all for a government 1,000 years ago. Capital recycling and credit.
This is where Wang Anshi was his most radical and also his most controversial.
We're talking about the Green Sprouts Law, the Qing Miao Fa, and the Market Exchange Law, the Shi Fa.
Right. And here, the state is acting explicitly as a financial player, a liquidity provider.
The Green Sprouts Law is the one everyone talks about, right?
Yeah.
It's maybe the most contested of all his policies. It was designed to tackle rural poverty and usury.
Yes, exactly. So farmers always faced what they called the spring famine.
Okay, what's that?
It's that awful time of year when last year's crops have run out, but the new harvest isn't ready yet.
So they have no food and no money.
Right. They needed money just to survive and to buy seeds to plant for the next season, so they were forced to go to private loan sharks.
Who charged insane interest rates, I assume.
Ruinous rates. 50%, 100%, sometimes even more. This cycle of debt just kept the rural population completely impoverished, which of course was terrible for the state's long-term tax base.
And meanwhile, the state has all this grain and money just sitting in its warehouses and treasury.
Exactly. Idle capital, producing zero value. So the Green Sprouts Law mobilized that idle capital.
Yeah.
The government would lend grain or money to farmers during that critical spring period at an interest rate of around 20% per year.
Which was way lower than the loan sharks.
Much, much lower. And the loan was just paid back after the harvest came in.
So this is working on a few different levels here. First, it's a social safety net, right? It stops families from falling into ruin. Second, it stabilizes the whole agricultural system by making sure planting actually happens. And third, the 20% interest actually makes a profit for the state.
On capital that was otherwise just sitting there doing nothing. We would recognize this today immediately. It's a form of microfinance.
Or like an agricultural development bank.
Exactly. It's a strategic government intervention designed to stabilize society, fight predatory lending, and make money all at the same time. It treats the government's treasury like a working bank, not a dusty old vault.
That is just a staggering conceptual leap for the 11th century. But he didn't start at farming, right? This idea of the state as a financial player extended to commerce with the Market Exchange Law.
the Shifa.
Yeah.
This law dealt with the price volatility and inefficiencies in the commercial markets. Merchants often had huge inventory problems.
Like having too much stock and prices would crash.
Right, or needing a quick bit of cash to expand their business. So the government set up these special bureaus. They would either provide low-interest loans to merchants or, and this is the critical part, the government itself would act as a massive wholesaler and a stabilization fund.
A stabilization fund? What do you mean?
So let's say there was a sudden glut of silk on the market and prices were about to collapse. The government firms would step in and buy up the excess silk at a fair price.
So the state becomes the buyer of last resort.
Yes, they'd store the goods, wait for the market price to recover, and then resell it. This prevented commercial crises, it managed price swings, it stabilized the supply chain.
And again, it generated a profit for the state on its circulating money.
This is so far beyond simple market regulation. Wang Anshi was positioning the state as an active financial agent, manipulating prices, managing inventory risk, providing credit. He believed that the velocity of money, the speed at which it circulated through lending and trading, that was just as vital a source of national wealth as growing rice.
This is the definitive break with that traditional, agrarian mindset.
It is. He wasn't just interested in the physical harvest from a field. He was obsessed with the flow and the management of commercial capital.
Okay, so we have infrastructure, efficiency, and credit. That just leaves the last one, pathway 4, strengthening management.
Or, basic administrative competence. Because you can have the best laws in the world, but if you don't actually know who owns what, the whole system just falls apart.
This is the administrative cleanup.
And it was embodied by the Square Fields and Equal Tax Law, the Fangtian Jinshui Fa. It's maybe the least dramatic of the reforms, but it was arguably the most essential foundation for everything else.
So what did it actually do?
It was essentially a national land audit combined with a tax reform. Square Fields meant they went out and precisely surveyed and measured every single piece of farmable land in the empire.
An equal tax.
Meant using those precise measurements to base taxes strictly on the actual size and the fertility of the land.
And why was that so revolutionary? Because in any pre-modern empire, the rich and powerful always find ways to cheat the system.
Always. Large, powerful landowners would consistently hide parts of their land from the official records. Or they'd claim their best land was actually poor quality, and they'd evade huge amounts of tax.
Which means the actual tax burden falls much more heavily on the small, powerless farmers who can't hide anything.
Precisely. So this law was a direct frontal assault on elite tax evasion. It promised not just more money for the state, but more fairness for everyone else.
It's classic administrative efficiency. You have to have accurate data. If you don't know who owns what, where it is, your tax base is a mess, and your whole system is unfair and inefficient.
This was designed to fix the foundational data layer of the entire empire.
So if we pull it all together, we have this incredible system built on 4 pillars: infrastructure, comparative advantage, state credit, and tax audits. It's just hard to overstate how revolutionary this all was.
It's not just a small change. It represents a fundamentally different way of looking at the state and the economy. If you look at typical imperial reforms throughout history, in Rome, in medieval Europe, the toolkit was usually very small.
Right. Cut spending, maybe redistribute some land.
Or tighten the state's grip on monopolies like salt and iron. Wang Anshi, he focused on commercial exchange, on capital flow, on investment. He broke the ultimate conservative rule of imperial finance, living within one's means.
That's the core intellectual break, isn't it?
It is. The traditional wisdom was that you measure expenditure by revenue. You cut your spending to match your income. Wang Anshi said, no, we will increase strategic spending in order to grow future income.
It's an aggressive, almost Keynesian fiscal policy.
He was an early advocate of mercantilism, the idea that trade and capital generate national wealth in a society that was fanatically devoted to revering agriculture and suppressing commerce. He was this lone visionary island in a vast sea of agrarian conservatism.
This focus on commercial activity and managing capital as the main jobs of the state, it just made his reforms totally unique.
For any pre-modern land empire, yes.
But, and this is the huge question, if the design was so ingenious, so advanced, and it seemed so complete, covering everything from infrastructure to tax audits, why do we always call the Wang Anshi reform a failure?
Well, we have to start by acknowledging the paradox. If the only goal was to solve the immediate financial crisis, he actually succeeded. wildly.
On paper, the results were good.
They were stunning. The revenue increase was massive.
How massive?
During the period under Emperor Song Shenzong, state revenue went up by over 63% compared to before the reforms.
63%.
That is a jaw-dropping, immediate financial turnaround. The government coffers were full. The state was solvent.
So the dynamic design did work. It generated the wealth, but the execution, the delivery mechanism, that's where the collision happened.
That is the absolute tragedy of it all. Wang Anshi came up with this brilliant dynamic financial model, but he had to implement it using a static, rigid, and ultimately exploitative imperial bureaucracy.
The system itself just didn't have the scaffolding to support that kind of modern complexity.
It didn't. And the Green Sprouts Law is the perfect example of this collision between his beautiful intent and the ugly reality.
Right. It was designed to be like microfinance, to offer low-interest relief to the poor.
But what actually happened was horrifying. The local officials, they were under immense pressure from the central government to meet those impressive new revenue targets.
Oh.
So they didn't act like bankers, assessing risk or helping people in need. They acted like tax collectors.
You mean they forced the loans on people?
Absolutely. They forcibly handed out money and grain to farmers, whether they needed it or not, whether they wanted it or not, just to inflate their local revenue numbers and hit their interest collection targets.
Oh, that's awful.
And then, when it was time to pay it back, the officials used the full coercive power of the imperial state, including violence, to get that principal and interest back.
So a law that was meant to fight loan sharks. It essentially turned the government into the biggest, most violent loan shark in the entire country.
It became pure administrative robbery. The financial sophistication of the idea was completely destroyed by the institutional inability to execute it. The officials couldn't run a complex credit scheme because the only tool they knew how to use was force.
And the infrastructure law, the one that was supposed to boost production.
That fell victim to just systemic fraud and incompetence. Officials would report that they had spent huge sums of money and used tons of labor.
But the projects were shoddily done or the money was stolen.
Exactly. You had embezzlement, you had incompetently managed projects. It led to wasted money and wasted lives instead of economic growth. The incentive was to report success, not to actually achieve it.
It just proves that a genius idea is worthless if the system you have in place can't execute it with any integrity. So we need to break down the root causes here. The imperial system had, 3 fundamental flaws that made this whole thing impossible?
Let's start with the deepest one, the bedrock flaw. Defect 1, the lack of a property basis.
Okay, what does that mean?
Modern financial systems, especially anything involving credit, they rely on the absolute legal protection of private property rights.
Right. If I lend you money, I need to know that my claim to repayment is protected by law and that there are independent courts to enforce our contract.
Correct. But in the Song Dynasty's imperial system, the emperor was, in theory, the ultimate owner of all land, all wealth. Property rights were conditional, they weren't absolute. And, just as important, there were no independent professional market organizations. No chartered banks, no professional risk assessors, no independent legal bodies.
So when the government tried to act like a development bank with the Green Sprouts Law,
the whole mechanism just degenerated. Modern lending is based on professional risk assessment and contract law. But when the rule of law is weak and independent institutions don't exist, the state's power to lend, which is backed by its army, it just collapses into coercion and seizure.
So the financial innovation was dropped into a system that didn't have the necessary institutional innovation to support it.
They had the blueprint for a modern financial market, but there was no legal bedrock for it to stand on. Wang Anshi's design needed an environment like what you saw later in Renaissance Europe, a growing respect for private property, independent merchant guilds. Without that, state finance is just state plunder.
That's a huge structural weakness, and it leads right into the second big problem, right? Defect 2, overburdening state functions.
This one is all about administrative capacity. I mean, think about what Wang Anshi was asking the Song government to be.
Everything.
A central bank, an infrastructure developer like the TVA, a national wholesaler, a credit regulator, and a tax auditor, all at once.
It's an impossible jump. You're asking this traditional agrarian government, which was only really designed to collect taxes, keep the peace, and fight wars, to suddenly become a sophisticated, modern developmental state.
The transition was impossible. The traditional empire had administrative and military capabilities, but it had none of the specialized professional knowledge you need to manage complex economic development or financial markets. They didn't have trained accountants or project managers or financial analysts.
You're asking a system that was designed to measure rice fields to suddenly start managing market stabilization and interest rates. The bureaucracy just buckled under the complexity.
It did, and this functional overload meant the whole system failed to do any of these new jobs well.
Which brings us to the third and maybe most critical defect. Defect 3, limitations of bureaucratic selection. The human capital problem.
This is it. Wang Anshi's plans needed technocrats. He needed officials who were trained in finance, in project management, and economic analysis to actually run these incredibly complex and nuanced schemes.
But who were the officials in the Song Dynasty? They were the Shi de Fu, the scholar officials.
Selected through the imperial examination system. They were experts in Confucian classics, in poetry, in maintaining social harmony.
Their entire education was basically the opposite of financial management. The Confucian ethic actively looked down on commerce and making a profit.
Their training was all about being moral exemplars, not about calculating interest rates or managing inventory risk.
It's the ultimate skills mismatch. You are asking a group of classical scholars to run a modern, multi-billion-dollar investment bank.
The analogy is perfect. It's like asking a medieval church clergyman to run a modern hedge fund. The expertise just wasn't there. And because the officials didn't have the professional competence to manage these complex financial tools responsibly, they just fell back on the only tools they knew.
Administrative orders and coercive force.
So instead of carrying out these dynamic, nuanced policies, they just simplified them into crude, exploitative commands. The Green Sprouts Law became forced debt collection. The Water Conservation Law became a way to commit fraud.
So the whole system was designed to produce philosopher kings, not financial engineers.
Exactly. Wang Anshi needed them to have both the moral desire to help the people and the technical skill to manage complex finance. But the system only provided the former, and let's be honest, often not even that.
So, to sum it all up, Wang Anshi's incredibly dynamic vision just crashed violently against this static, triple defective reality. No property rights for finance, an overburdened administration, and a pool of human talent that was totally unprepared for the job.
His ideas were 1,000 years ahead of the institutional and human foundation needed to support them. It was a spectacular collision, and its fate was sealed from the start.
And what was the immediate result of that collision?
The failure was swift. Wang Anshi resigned as prime minister in 1076. His lifelong political enemy, Sima Guang, a staunch conservative, took power and immediately started abolishing almost every single one of the reforms.
The whole experiment was just dismantled.
Almost as fast as had been built.
And yet, history has never been able to forget this attempt. Historians just keep looking back at this spectacular failure with this profound sense of regret. Why does this event cast such a long shadow?
There are really two main reasons for that regret, and they're interlocked. The first one is tied to just how modern his methods were. Because he was using commercial and financial tools, things that foreshadow microfinance and Keynesian economics, the failure is often seen as China missing this critical opportunity.
A chance for an internal organic modernization.
Yes. It's this feeling that China had a real chance 1,000 years ago to pivot towards a more commercial, dynamic state, and it tragically missed that path.
And the second reason for the regret.
It's more philosophical. It's about this broader conflict within ancient Chinese governance. Wang Anshi represented this minority mercantilist idea, the belief that trade, lending, and the circulation of capital were the true paths to national strength.
And that commercial idea was always fighting against the crushing weight of the orthodox agrarian mindset.
Exactly. The dominant ideology of revering agriculture and suppressing commerce was basically immovable. Reformers like Wang Anshi, or even earlier figures like Yang, who argued for state-driven economic dynamism, they were repeatedly crushed by the conservative land-based power structure. The regret is that these commercial and financial engines were just constantly being stifled.
It's the lament that the tools for progress were there, but the ideological and institutional ability to use them just wasn't.
Which brings us right back to the central paradox. You have this era-defining idea that solves an immediate crisis, generates stunning revenue, and contains the blueprint for modern state finance. But because the underlying system, the bureaucracy, the laws, the education couldn't support it, it led to absolute disaster.
So if an idea is 1,000 years ahead of its time, but the institutional foundation you need to execute it safely just doesn't exist, is that idea still valuable? Or is genius completely meaningless without the necessary groundwork to build upon? That is the question Wang Anshi leaves ringing through history.
Imagine this. The year is 1141 AD. You've got General Yu Fei. He's the pride of the southern Song Dynasty, and he is absolutely triumphant.
He's on a roll. His army has just smashed the Jurchen invaders. He's right on the verge of taking back the lost northern capital.
This guy is a legend. I mean, literally a legend etched into his skin. His back has that famous tattoo, serve the country with utmost loyalty.
He's just unstoppable on the battlefield.
But then the unthinkable happens. It's not an ambush. It's not some surprise counterattack.
No, it's an order from his own emperor.
And it's not just one order. In quick succession, 12 gold plaques arrive. Just simple gold plaques.
And every single one carries the exact same command repeated 12 times, just to make sure the message is crystal clear.
The message being,
recall your troops. It's crushing, utterly final.
And we all know how this story ends. It's heartbreaking. Yu Fei, this absolute symbol of loyalty, he obeys, he goes back to the capital.
And he's immediately stripped of his power and then, ultimately executed.
For centuries, everyone has focused on his obedience, this tragic, pure obedience. Why did he do it? Why didn't this unbelievably powerful, successful general just say no?
And that's the romantic view, right? We see it as this individual tragedy, a personal betrayal between a general and his emperor. But that's the storybook version.
So what's the real story?
Today, we're going past the man, past the tragedy, and we're digging into the deep, unforgiving structure of the empire itself. We're going to analyze the fiscal history.
The money.
The money. Specifically, the military spending system that created this inescapable economic trap.
This is the deep dive into the unsolvable riddle of empire military finance. And our mission today is to really understand why a general who commanded a victorious army that adored him was actually, in reality, financially chained to the capital.
And how that whole system forced the empire, time and time again, to choose political security over actual battlefield effectiveness.
It's the ultimate trade-off, isn't it? The emperor's control versus the general's ability to win a war.
That's it in a nutshell.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because Yu Fei's story, it feels like the perfect key to unlocking this massive 2,000-year-old economic problem.
To really get why Yu Fei was so paralyzed fiscally, you have to look at what came right before the Song Dynasty. I mean, they didn't just pop up out of nowhere.
Right, they were a reaction to something.
A huge reaction.
Yeah.
They came out of the absolute chaos of the late Tang Dynasty, and then that whole 5 dynasties and 10 kingdoms period that followed.
And that era was all about warlordism, right? The Fan Zhen Guoju.
Exactly. The rule of regional military governors. It was just warlordism gone completely wild. You had these local commanders who held all the power.
They had the troops, they collected the taxes.
They often just declared themselves kings. It was this existential cancer that had basically destroyed the idea of a central government.
So the Song founders look at all this history, this chaos.
And they come to a very simple conclusion. The biggest threat to our new empire isn't some foreign army. It's not the invaders.
It's our own generals.
It's the powerful general with too much local authority.
Yeah.
So the entire, and I mean the entire political engineering of the Song Dynasty was designed to do one thing.
Centralize.
Radically.
Oh.
An extreme form of centralization meant to just crush any chance of a warlord ever popping up again.
And their solution was to basically build weakness into the front lines. That's what's so wild. They created this whole system of checks and balances that was all about protecting the throne.
Even if it meant the army couldn't really fight effectively.
Yes, even at the cost of being able to project power.
And this whole philosophy is summed up perfectly in their famous 8-character rule.
What's that?
It's a principle of command separation. It translates to, troops do not know their generals, and generals do not know their troops.
Wow. Say that again?
Troops do not know their generals, and generals do not know their troops.
That's a blueprint for political security, not military victory. If you're constantly rotating the generals and you're constantly shuffling the units under their command,
no personal loyalty can ever form. The soldier isn't loyal to the guy standing next to him in battle. His salary, his loyalty, it's all owed to this distant, abstract idea of the emperor.
it's brilliant political defense in a way, but what does that actually mean on the battlefield?
It's a disaster. I mean, how are you supposed to win these complex campaigns against, say, the Jurchen or the Khitan, these highly motivated specialized cavalry forces, when your general is constantly meeting his troops for the first time?
You can't. There's no unit cohesion, no trust, no time to specialize in certain tactics or get to know the terrain.
None of it. It's the ultimate paradox of trying to run a state like that. You sacrifice military punch for the guarantee of political stability.
They designed an army that was just strong enough to put down a small rebellion at home.
But structurally too weak to fight a real, determined enemy from the outside.
And that system works perfectly fine until a major external foe actually shows up at your door.
Which is exactly what happened. When the Zhuo Qin invaded and forced the Sung to abandon the entire north of China, to just flee south, that whole weak rotational system just collapsed overnight.
Because survival suddenly demanded something completely different.
An instantaneous change. Out of pure necessity, right there on the front lines, generals like Yu Fei had to completely break that 8-character rule.
They had to create these, what you called private armies.
They were the complete opposite of the Sung ideal. Combat effectiveness was the only thing that mattered. And to get that, you needed deep, personal, almost family-like relationships.
So the general wasn't just a commander anymore.
He was a benefactor, a provider, sometimes even a kind of surrogate father figure. The loyalty was intense, it was personal, and it was directed straight at the man leading them.
And the Yue family army, the one at the center of our story, that was the best example of this.
The absolute prime example. Highly motivated, incredibly well-trained, and most importantly, it was winning.
But once that peace treaty gets signed between the Sung and the Jin,
Even though it was a terrible, humiliating peace treaty.
the emperor's priority just snaps right back.
Immediately. He looks at these victorious armies, these powerful forces loyal to one man, and he sees the exact same internal threat that his dynasty was founded to prevent. He'd sort of solved the external problem.
But in doing so, he'd resurrected the ghost of the warlord.
The integration crisis was totally unavoidable. He had to reorganize those armies, fold them back into the imperial guards. It was a move driven by pure, rational self-preservation.
Which brings us back to the big puzzle. Why did Yu Fei, this powerful general with this devoted army, just submit?
Because political power, and even military power, it always flows from the treasury. And the state, the emperor, held the ultimate choke point,
The money.
the centralized financial system.
This is the moment, right here. This is where the whole story pivots from a tragedy of loyalty to the cold, hard reality of economics. Let's get into the numbers.
The numbers are just staggering. They make any idea of defiance look, well, completely impossible. In the year 1137, the total central fiscal revenue for the entire southern Sung government was about 60 million guan.
And a guan is like a unit of currency.
Is a unit of account, yeah. Think of it as a string of 1,000 copper coins. So 60 million of those for the whole empire. Now let's look at the cost of Ye Fei's army.
Just his army alone.
The military expenditure for the Yue family army was nearly 7 million guan.
Wait, 7 million out of a total of 60 million.
Yes.
You're telling me that one man's army was costing nearly 12% of the entire national budget.
That is the impossible proportional dependency. He couldn't sustain that army on his own. He couldn't just live off the land or tax the local area.
Not like the old warlords who control their own tax base.
Exactly. He was operating under a centralized revenue system. The money came from the capital. If he defied the emperor, the money would be cut off.
And his army would just dissolve.
Within months, maybe even weeks, financial collapse.
So the loyalty tattoo, the string of victories, the fact that his men would die for him, at the end of the day, none of it mattered against the numbers on a ledger.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Yu Fei's tragedy wasn't a failure of loyalty, it was a failure of the ledger. He was financially chained to the emperor. And that dynamic made any real effective military action impossible the second it conflicted with the political security of the throne.
And let's dig into that 60 million guan a bit more. Where was it even coming from? If we know that, we can see the pressure points.
Well, the Sung was more commercial than earlier dynasties, but the foundation was still, the land tax, the agricultural base. But a huge chunk of their money came from state monopolies.
Salt and iron.
Salt and iron, especially. And also, increasingly, from commercial taxes on the booming merchant class. They had a really dynamic economy in some ways.
So when Yu Fei's army is demanding 7 million guan, that money is being pulled directly from the taxes on farmers, the salt that everyone needs, the trade that keeps the cities alive.
Every single guan spent on his army was a guan that couldn't be spent on civilian functions. Or, more likely, it was a guan that had to be generated by some new crushing tax.
And the burden was even worse because, well, their territory had been cut in half, hadn't it? The southern Sung?
Exactly. They lost the entire north, but they were still trying to pay for an army big enough for the whole empire. This meant massive, unbearable tax hikes on the people they still controlled.
The people must have been miserable.
They were impoverished, desperate for the war to just end, desperate for the endless spending to stop.
And that misery, that desperation, that gives the emperor all the political cover he needs.
It's the perfect cover. The officials in the court who were pushing for peace could frame it as a fiscal necessity. They could say, look, we have to dismantle Yefei's expensive army to give the people relief, even if it meant accepting a humiliating truce with the enemy.
The finance system didn't just constrain the general, it turned public opinion against him and sealed his fate.
Making peace, however bad that peace was, became the only financially viable option for the state.
What's fascinating here is that this whole dilemma for the Sung, this impossible choice between an expensive, effective army and a cheap, ineffective one, this wasn't some one-off mistake they made.
No, not at all. It was an inherent structural flaw baked into the DNA of the imperial system for, well, 2 millennia.
The Sung tragedy, then, it came from them choosing one particular model of military funding.
That's right. They used what's called the recruitment system, or Mu Bing Jie. This is the professional model.
Yeah.
You have full-time, salaried soldiers. They don't farm. Their only job is to be a soldier.
Which sounds great, but it means it's high cost. You have to pay for everything.
Everything. Wages, weapons, food, logistics, training, even pensions. It's a massive centralized financial burden.
And the empire was always tempted by the opposite model, wasn't it? The soldier-farmer unity system, the Bing Nung Hei Jie.
Right.
Which sounds on the surface fiscally amazing, like a military utopia. But what did that actually look like on the ground?
In that system, it was decentralized, a kind of militia. Citizens would be given a plot of land, they'd farm it for their own livelihood, and then they'd train as soldiers during the off-season.
And crucially, they had to provide their own gear.
Often, yes, or at least maintain it themselves. The state's financial burden was tiny in comparison.
So the treasury is only paying for what, rations during an active war, maybe some small rewards.
Exactly. All the major costs are dispersed. They're outsourced directly onto the population itself.
You can draw a pretty clear modern parallel here, can't you?
Absolutely. The recruitment system is your professional force. Highly skilled, specialized, always ready. Think modern special forces or historically elite mercenaries.
And the soldier-farmer system is the cheap militia. Your National Guard, or maybe even going back to ancient Greek hoplites or medieval peasant levies, low skill, not always prepared.
And the Chinese Empire was just perpetually trapped between these two choices. It was either a heavy, centralized treasury to support a strong army,
or a light, dispersed treasury that supported an army that was basically ineffective.
and that trap, that choice, it defined this agonizing cycle of military policy for dynasty after dynasty. They would just ping-pong back and forth between these two models, desperately trying to find a balance that just didn't exist.
You should trace that cycle, because it's in the failure of each system that you see the real structural flaws.
Let's do it. Start with the Han Dynasty, the first great unifying empire.
So where did they start?
They began with a soldier-farmer unity system, and it was fine, for consolidating power internally. But then you get Emperor Wu of Han.
And he wants to expand.
Massively. He's pushing west, fighting the Xiongnu, and suddenly you need sustained long-distance campaigns. You need specialization in cavalry, in logistics.
You can't just ask a farmer to drop his plow and march 1,000 miles into the desert for a 2-year campaign. That requires a professional.
It absolutely does. So the recruitment system becomes a necessity for expansion and for defending those new long frontiers. And Emperor Wu gets clever with the funding. He starts collecting commutation fees. Basically, citizens could pay a fee to get out of their soldier-farmer military duty.
Ah, so you monetize the obligation.
Exactly. And that revenue is then used to hire full-time professional soldiers. It's a smart fiscal move, but it's the first step towards centralizing that cost again.
Okay, so now fast forward a few centuries to the Sui and early Tang dynasties. They try to go back, right, to the cheaper model.
They do. They bring in something called the Fu Bing Jie system. It was probably the most sophisticated version of the soldier-farmer unity idea ever developed.
How did it work?
It was based on military households maintaining their own land holdings. That land generated local revenue and guaranteed that the soldiers could support themselves. And this system, for a while, it worked brilliantly. It fueled the early Tang's massive expansion without bankrupting the central government.
But if it was so great, why did it fail by the mid-Tang? This is where the social reality starts to chip away at the economic theory.
There were a few key pressures. First, the land base itself just eroded. As the empire got richer, powerful aristocratic families started annexing land, buying it up, sometimes illegally.
Meaning fewer soldiers actually owned the land they needed to support themselves.
Exactly. Second, the military reality changed. Soldiers were needed to garrison distant frontiers for years at a time. It became impossible for them to go home and farm.
So the soldier is now permanently separated from his farm, which means he needs a salary.
He needs to be paid from the center. The whole economic basis of the system just collapses. And third, you just had endemic corruption in local training. Commanders fake the records, cut corners.
So when a real crisis hits...
Like the Anlushan rebellion in the mid-Tang, the Fubing Jie system just failed catastrophically. It was a paper tiger.
Yeah.
And the dynasty was forced to rely almost entirely on mercenaries and professional units.
A full-blown reversion back to the expensive recruitment system.
The lesson was just brutal and clear. If you want an effective army, you need professionals. And if you have professionals, you have to centralize the cost, which leads you straight back to the financial black hole that the Sung fell into.
And the cycle just keeps going. The Ming Dynasty comes along and they try again, don't they? They try to restore a cheaper system.
One more time. They create the Wei So system, or the military household system, the Jinhu Jie.
What was the idea there?
They designated entire families in perpetuity as military households. They were tied to specific land grants and garrisons. A soldier was born into his duty. He inherited the land, but also the obligation to train and supply himself.
It was designed to be permanent and critically zero cost to the central government.
But the exact same thing happens. Land annexation runs rampant. The powerful local gentry and officials start illegally seizing the best land allocated to these military families.
Leaving the soldier's family with barren land or no land at all.
They can't feed themselves, let alone afford the weapons and training to be an effective soldier. The result?
Mass desertion.
Huge desertions. By the middle of the Ming Dynasty, they had to start hiring new professional troops just to fill the empty slots.
Yeah.
The government was suddenly paying salaries for troops that were supposed to be free.
So they're forced back again into the crushing debt of the recruitment system.
Which then carries right over into the final dynasty, the Qing.
Here's where it gets really interesting. This whole historical cycle, this back and forth, it shows that even though the soldier-farmer system was always what the treasury wanted,
the realities of external threats and internal social decay meant that the expensive professional recruitment system always won out in the end. The market, if you will, demanded professional soldiers, even if the state couldn't really afford to pay for them.
It was always a choice between a heavy treasury supporting an army that could actually win,
or a light treasury supporting an army that was structurally designed to fail. And over, that high-cost choice proved fatal to the state's solvency.
And we haven't even touched on the logistics, which must have been a nightmare for the recruitment system.
A completely different world. The professional system demanded this huge, complex bureaucracy of supply chain managers, massive centralized granaries, and the infrastructure to mint and distribute coins for wages.
Whereas the soldier-farmer system just outsourced all of that. All that logistical complexity was pushed down to the individual farmer.
When you centralize logistics for an army of, say, 500,000 men, the bureaucratic overhead becomes a massive cost in and of itself. A cost the system just couldn't escape if it wanted any semblance of professionalism.
So that decision to go with the professional model, to prioritize effectiveness over cost, it wasn't just a small budget issue. It was a structural collapse waiting to happen.
Especially in the Sung era. We talked about Yu Fei's army taking up 12% of the budget, but what was the overall military cost for the state?
This is the truly shocking figure. During the Song Dynasties, military spending frequently accounted for, what was it, over 80%?
Over 80% of total fiscal expenditure.
That number it's almost impossible to get your head around.
80%. Just try to imagine a modern corporation dedicating 80% of its entire budget to its security department. There's nothing left for R&D, for operations, for marketing, for basic maintenance.
And this brings us to a really important economic idea, the crowding out effect.
Exactly. Can you explain that for everyone?
It's when one single colossal expenditure soaks up virtually all the available resources in a system. It starves every other essential function of the state.
And in this case, that colossal military spending meant there was zero or close to zero state investment in any other public, social, or economic function.
We're talking about the absolute basics of running a country. Things like road construction, canal maintenance, flood control.
State schools, social welfare, promoting trade. All of it gone.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the state's inability to invest in public works is just choking the empire's economic engine.
Absolutely. The rivers aren't dredged, which leads to devastating floods that wipe out farmland for a generation.
The roads and canals fall apart, which makes trade incredibly expensive and slows down all economic growth.
The empire was literally cannibalizing its own long-term health, starving the civilian sector, just to pay for short-term, expensive military security.
Which creates this vicious cycle of low growth and high debt.
And what happens when you have an unexpected cost? A war indemnity you have to pay, or a surprise campaign you have to launch.
If you're already spending 80% of your money, what desperate moves are you left with?
The state have to turn to these inherently destructive short-term fixes. They start levying crushing surtaxes. During the decline of the Ming Dynasty, for example, they brought in the Liaosi troop surtax.
Which was what?
An emergency military tax that fell on already impoverished farmers, all to fund a border defense thousands of miles away that they would never see.
And that surtax specifically becomes a major cause of the internal rebellions that eventually brought the dynasty down.
It's a self-fulfilling prophecy of instability. And they had other desperate measures too. They started selling official government posts and noble titles,
Basically monetizing access to political power.
which completely destabilizes the bureaucracy. Or they just print money.
Currency devaluation. The Sun were famous for this, weren't they? They invented some of the earliest forms of paper money, the jiaozi.
They did. And the government repeatedly printed massive amounts of it to cover military shortfalls, which led to, predictable hyperinflation.
These are all the classic signs of a state on the absolute brink, just sacrificing any hope of future stability for immediate cash.
And this high-cost system, over time, it fundamentally warped the entire purpose of the military. The original mandate for an empire's army is what?
External defense. Expanding your territory? Protecting the borders?
Right. But when the treasury is always empty and the people are miserable from all the taxes, that mandate begins to shift.
By the late Ming, and especially in the Qing dynasty, the primary job of the army wasn't defending the frontier anymore.
It was almost exclusively about suppressing internal rebellions.
And that is the ultimate tragic paradox.
Right.
That's the breaking point for legitimacy, isn't it? The people are paying that staggering 80% tax bill to fund an army whose main job is to repress them.
When the military's function shifts from external defense to internal repression, the whole social contract just collapses. The massive military budget is no longer seen as a public investment in security.
It's just a tool of dynastic violence.
And this complete failure becomes undeniable in the last century of the Qing dynasty. You see this high-cost military machine failing on both fronts simultaneously.
Repeated humiliating defeats against Western powers, that's the external failure.
And at the exact same time, the failure to suppress internal threats like the massive, incredibly costly Taiping Heavenly Kingdom Rebellion.
It's the worst of both worlds. High cost, low efficiency. It's the total structural bankruptcy of the entire military fiscal system.
And we have to come back to the core flaw of that recruitment system they were all stuck with. At its heart, it was basically a mercenary system.
The soldiers were fighting for the salary, for the pay packet, not out of loyalty to some shared idea of a nation.
Exactly. And that explains why the financial burden just kept growing and growing, while the actual combat effectiveness of the soldiers often got worse over time. You can pay mercenaries.
But you can't necessarily buy their patriotism. You can't buy their will to fight and die when things get really tough.
It created this terrible demand-supply imbalance. The state always needed more security, which drove up the cost of hiring soldiers, but it never received the genuine loyalty it needed for real, long-term stability.
You see that in Western history, too. The late Roman Empire, right? Increasingly reliant on expensive non-Roman mercenaries.
Who had absolutely no vested interest in the long-term survival of Rome. They just wanted their quarterly pay.
And that dependency is a huge part of what ushered in the collapse.
It's the exact same structural vulnerability. The empire could hire soldiers, but it could never buy their loyalty.
So the imperial system, for thousands of years, was just caught in this impossible loop. If you want an effective army, you need the high-cost, professional model.
Which then destroys your political legitimacy and causes internal collapse.
Which then forces you to revert to the low-cost, low-effectiveness militia model.
Which then guarantees you'll be destroyed by an external enemy. It was a truly unsolvable riddle, at least within that dynastic framework.
So how did modern states finally break the cycle? How did they solve this riddle that trapped every emperor from the Han to the Qing?
They found a third way, a model that completely changed the financial and psychological contract between the state and the soldier.
The citizen army system, conscription.
That is the critical shift. The citizen army is still supported by taxes, by participation, but its fundamental motivation isn't profit.
It's a sense of shared political responsibility. It's rooted in this idea of a general will, of a nation that belongs to everyone.
Think of the soldiers of the French Revolution. They weren't fighting and dying for the king's salary. They were fighting for this new, abstract concept of the homeland.
Or the American Continental Army. It was made up of citizens who believed, rightly or wrongly, that the state was acting in their direct interest.
And this system is only fiscally possible and politically stable if the state is seen to serve the public interest. A citizen is willing to pay taxes for and risk their life in a national army only if they believe that state is representative and acting on their behalf.
And modern states also use new financial tools the emperors never could. They adopted systems of national debt, of centralized taxation, based on representative government.
It's a different fiscal contract. You can spread the cost of a war over generations because you're confident that the government will remain legitimate enough to collect taxes in the future.
That's the key distinction. The imperial system, just by its dynastic nature, existed to protect the ruling family and the central power, not the public interest.
It could never successfully make that transition to a citizen army because it could never convince its subjects that the empire was worth dying for, only that the salary was worth taking.
So if we step all the way back from Yofei's personal tragedy, the problem wasn't his character, and it wasn't even the professional army itself. The problem was that the whole military finance dilemma was structurally insoluble within the framework of an empire.
That structural failure is what necessitated the empire's eventual exit from history.
We've spent this time breaking down the two options that were available to every imperial government: the expensive recruitment system
And the ineffective soldier-farmer unity system.
and we saw how that choice created an inescapable fiscal trap that just devoured the empire from the inside out. So here's the final thought. Why did a third option, the modern citizen army, rooted in a shared purpose, why did that never emerge naturally within that imperial framework?
What does that fundamental structural lack of a third way tell you about the inherent inescapable limits of dynastic power? If you found this discussion useful, maybe learned something new, definitely hit that subscribe button. We do these deep dives regularly, exploring valuable ideas.
We appreciate you tuning in.
Yeah, thanks for joining us.